On January 3rd, U.S. Special Forces yoinked the president of Venezuela out of his own capital. 4 months later, the director of the CIA walks into Havana and tells the Cubans to learn that lesson. A 94-year-old is indicted for murder, an aircraft carrier turns south. Cuba starts printing war pamphlets. Here's what's actually happening and what nobody is talking about. May 14th, 2026. Cuba's energy minister steps to a microphone and admits the country has completely run out of oil and diesel. Havana is enduring blackouts of 20 to 22 hours a day. 6 days later, the USS Nimitz strike group enters the Caribbean. The same day, the U.S. Justice Department unseals a murder indictment against a 94-year-old former president of Cuba. And Cuba begins handing its citizens a pamphlet. The title? Family Guide for Protection Against Military Aggression. That doesn't feel like a bluff. To understand what's happening in Cuba, you have to start in Caracas. January 3rd, 2026, in an operation codenamed Absolute Resolve, U.S. Delta Force, the CIA, the FBI, and the DEA descended on the Fort Tayuna military complex. They captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Zulia Flores. The pair were flown to the USS Iwo Jima, then on to New York to face federal narcoterrorism charges. An estimated 32 Cubans, described by Havana as military and intelligence personnel, were reportedly killed during the operation. That was January 3rd. 26 days later, on January 29th, President Trump signed Executive Order 14380. It declared a national emergency with respect to Cuba and authorized tariffs on any country supplying oil to the island, directly or indirectly. The New York Times would later characterize it as the first effective blockade of Cuba since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The blockade worked, brutally. Cuba's economy historically depended on oil from Venezuela and Mexico. With Maduro in a New York holding cell and Mexico facing tariff threats, the pipelines closed. On March 31, 2026, a single Russian tanker, the Anatoly Kaladkin, delivered roughly 730,000 barrels of crude to the port of Matanzas. It was the only major shipment to reach Cuba in more than 4 months. In February, UN human rights experts in Geneva condemned the U.S. fuel blockade as, quote, a serious violation of international law and, quote, an extreme form of unilateral economic coercion. On May 1st, Trump escalated again, signing Executive Order 14404, expanding blockade sanctions and adding secondary sanctions on any foreign financial institution doing business with Cuba. Then came May 14th. Cuban Energy Minister Vicente de Leve announced Cuba had completely run out of oil and diesel. Blackouts in Havana stretched to 22 hours a day. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, himself Cuban-American, claimed the blackouts were not the result of the U.S. blockade. PolitiFact claimed that as being half true. On the same day Cuba announced it was out of fuel, CIA Director John Ratcliffe was in Havana. It was the first trip by a CIA director to Cuba in over a decade. Ratcliffe met with Cuban Interior Minister Lazaro Casas, the head of Cuban intelligence, and Raul Guillermo Rodriguez Castro, known as Raulito, the grandson of Raul Castro. His message, according to reporting, the United States would, quote, seriously engage only if Cuba made fundamental changes. He reportedly urged Cuba to learn from what happened to Maduro. 6 days later, May 20th, at Miami's Freedom Tower, Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche unsealed the superseding indictment. The defendant, a former Cuban president, Raul Castro, age 94. The charges? Conspiracy to kill U.S. nationals, 4 counts of murder, and 2 counts of destruction of aircraft, tied to the February 24, 1996 shootdown of 2 brothers to the rescue planes. Blanche stated the U.S. expected Castro to appear, quote, by his own will or by another way. That same day, U.S. Southern Command announced that the USS Nimitz, Carrier Air Wing 17, the destroyer USS Gridley, and the replenishment ship USNS Patuxent had entered the Caribbean. Officially, it was part of an exercise called Southern Siege 2026. Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel called the indictment a, quote, political maneuver aimed at justifying military aggression. He was warned that the U.S. threats would trigger, quote, a bloodbath with incalculable consequences. Some in Washington saw what was coming. In March and again in May 2026, Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, joined by Senators Adam Schiff and Ruben Gallego, introduced war powers resolutions to prevent the U.S. military action against Cuba. Kaine argued that the oil blockade itself constituted an act of war. He gathered 51 members of Congress to sign a letter condemning it. On April 28th, the Senate voted on whether to advance the Cuban war powers resolution. It failed, 51 to 47. Republicans Susan Collins and Ron Paul crossed over to advance it. Democrat John Fetterman voted against. 2 weeks earlier, on April 15th, the outlets Zetio and USA Today had reported, citing anonymous sources, that the Pentagon had received a White House directive to ramp up preparations for possible military operations against Cuba. Southcom publicly denied actively rehearsing an invasion. Then on May 17th, Axios published a striking story. Citing classified intelligence shared by a senior Trump administration official, Axios reported Cuba had acquired more than 300 military drones from Russia and Iran since 2023, and that Cuban officials had internally discussed potentially using them against Guantanamo, U.S. warships, and possibly Key West. Notably, the same senior official told Axios the assentment, quote, could become part of a pretext for U.S. military action. And in Cuba itself, the government began circulating the Family Guide for Protection Against Military Aggression, a civilian pamphlet instructing families to pack survival kits and seek shelter at the sound of air raid sirens. Cuba's Deputy Foreign Minister, Carlos Fernandez de Cosio, said Cubans had become, quote, hostages trapped between two powers. Now we move from documented fact into the territory of speculation, what critics, analysts, and observers believe may actually be unfolding behind the official statements. Theory 1. The Maduro template. Critics, including Senator Kaine, have pointed out the Castro indictment closely mirrors the legal architecture used against Maduro before his January 3rd capture. The speculation that the murder charges against a 94-year-old former president are being positioned to create the same pretext for a snatch and grab operation. Theory 2. The pretext leak. The Axios drone story is, on its face, alarming, but the senior official who delivered it openly acknowledged the assessment could become part of a pretext for military action. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez, Senator Kaine, and Matt Duss of the Center for International Policy have all suggested the intelligence narrative is being built for a pretext rather than a warning. Theory 3. Distraction. In April 2026, while the U.S. was already engaged in a war with Iran, Trump stated, quote, we may stop by Cuba after we're finished with this. Some analysts have speculated that the renewed Cuba threat served as to redirect attention from an unpopular Iran war. Theory 4. Regime change short of invasion. Some observers believe the administration's actual goal isn't a near-term military invasion, but the collapse of the Cuban government before the end of 2026, engineered through fuel starvation, financial isolation, and constant military signaling. In Theory 5, the migration trigger. Critics warn a U.S. attack on Cuba could spark a mass migration crisis across the Florida Straits, a humanitarian and political shock that would dwarf previous Cuban exoduses. What we cannot confirm, there has been no U.S. military strike on Cuban soil, no authorization for use of military force, no declaration of war, no public Pentagon document confirming the alleged war planning directive, no evidence Cuba has actually attempted any strike on U.S. assets. What we can confirm is this: an effective fuel blockade, a national emergency declaration, a CIA director in Havana, a murder indictment of a former head of state, a carrier strike group in the Caribbean, a blocked war powers resolution, and a civilian population being told to pack survival kits. The pieces are on the board. Whether they move and when is the question almost nobody is asking out loud.